morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Emma, and I'm the YES Program Coordinator at Iron USA. Thank you for being here today for the four key tips to developing a high-impact resume and career. I'm really excited that I am joined by Dr. Craig Zelizer. Dr. Zelizer is the founder of PCDN, which connects a global community of changemakers to the tools, community, and opportunities to build careers of impact and scale change. He has strong experience in the development sector, academia, and social entrepreneurship. From 2005 to 2016, he served as a professor in the Conflict Resolution Program at Georgetown University, where he still serves as the Conflict Resolution Faculty Fellow. He has led trainings, workshops, and consultancies in over 20 countries and organizations, including with USIP, USAID, CRS, Rotary International, and others. Craig is a recognized leader in the social sector field. He has received several awards, including George Mason's School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution's Alumni of the Year Award and an Alumni Career Achievement Award from Central European University. Dr. Zelizer spent 2 years in Hungary as a Fulbright Scholar and was a Born Fellow in Bosnia, so he has plenty of study abroad experience just like our viewers. He has published widely on peacebuilding, entrepreneurship, and innovation in higher education. Today, he will be sharing 4 key tips to developing a high-impact resume and career. We will be keeping a close eye on all the comments on the Facebook Live feed, so please feel free to ask any questions. And without further ado, I'll give it to Craig.
Thank you, Emma, and it's wonderful to be with you all today, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to do a quick screen share so we can go over a couple of slides, and let me just find my PowerPoint. So what my goal is today is to provide a couple of actionable things that would be useful for anyone who is finished or completed a study abroad a few years ago and wants to advance your career, or at least is thinking about higher education. My goal is to keep this to less than 15 minutes, and I really want to hear your questions and comments. So as Emma said, please keep them coming through the Facebook Live, and we'll ensure we have plenty of time for them. And just as Emma said, I'm a huge believer in the power of study abroad and intercultural exchange, and so grateful for all the opportunities I've had in my life. And fellowships have really changed my life in a positive way. And while I was a full-time professor at Georgetown, I was also a Boren advisor, did a lot of foreign Fulbright work, and I really believe that if everyone can find the opportunity to apply for fellowships, doesn't mean you'll get them, it can really have a huge impact. So we're going to focus on 4 key tips, as Emma said. The first one is find your story and impact. Really thinking about how do you leverage your study abroad experience, whether it was recent or in the past, to help advance your career, and kind of what is the story about the career and the skills you have and where you're trying to have impact in the world, whatever that may be, whether it's nonprofit, banking, government, education. The second one is really talking about your study abroad experience, what employers are looking for. And there's actually been really pioneering research conducted by the International Institute for Education on this, about the benefit and the power of study abroad to impact your career positively. The third key area of tips is really your cover letter, your resume, and your online profile is really how to stand out and make your application competitive. And the fourth part is really the power of networks. So I'll dive right in, and before we get into any of the 4 models, I just want to show this one, oops, my email, sorry, I gotta turn off my email, sorry about that. So the first one is really thinking about, as you think about your career, one of the things, whatever sector you want to be in, this is a model that I really appreciate. It comes from the Amani Institute. It's a social enterprise training organization. I'm on their advisory board, and they just talk about 4 key components to thinking about your career at any stage. So the first thing is about, like, what do you love to do? And a lot of people, when they talk about careers, say, think about your passion or follow your passion. But that's not enough to build a career or a series of jobs. The second thing you have to think about, are you actually good at it? So I love to dance. I met my wife dancing. I live in Colombia, and I live in Medellin right now. I'm decent at dancing. I'm not great at dancing. So I love it, but I'm not great at it. Does the world need me to dance? Probably not. And is anyone going to pay me for it? No. So this is kind of a model to think about, like, what are you good at? What is the market willing to pay for? Does the world need it, and that type of stuff. And so one of the things, even before you get into the 4 tips, is really spend some time, and you can do this with peers, with career advisors. PCDN has a lot of resources, but really think about kind of what is your current place in the world. So this comes from a recent study from the International Institute of Education. You can look it up. I have the link here, and Emma can send it around. Is they did research on, and this is mostly I think from US students who studied abroad, at the undergrad level, possibly at the grad level, and they found these are the skills that often are developed through this study abroad experience. So these are things you might think about as you work on your career, your job applications, university applications, graduate school. So one of the core things is obviously intercultural skills. So whether you go to a country that speaks a different language or the same language, like one of the things that we all know that happens from our study abroad experiences is we become aware of how we're different and how we are the same and how to navigate those differences. The ability to be curious, flexible, the interpersonal skills. And on the right are really things that are career related. So in terms of communicating across cultures, the ability to solve problems, language competency, whether you're fluent in more than one language or, competent or you speak several languages, the more languages you speak, the better for your career. And that's made a huge difference in my career. And I love to learn languages, even though I was convinced when I was an undergrad I could never learn a language. And then the other skills you get in your sectoral areas. So if you're an environmental studies student and you studied abroad working on environmental issues, that has a huge impact. So these are some skills, and I would encourage you on your own time and with your peers is to really think about, just write down what are the core skills, knowledge, and abilities that you think you gained from your study abroad experience and what may be relevant to the career that you're trying to work into. So here's some key ways to think about going beyond the skills is how to leverage your experience. So we do a lot of work in PCDN on the fourth industrial revolution and how the nature of work is changing. And things are increasingly becoming automated, machine learning, computers are taking over a lot. But one of the findings from all the research to date is that even though there's going to be a lot of automation and changes in the job market, human soft skills are still key to the jobs of the future. So obviously, if you know soft skills and computers and coding, that's great. But the ability to work in teams, the ability to problem solve, the ability to vision, the ability to think creatively, those are all keys to jobs in many, many different sectors. Languages I've already talked about. One of the things that often people will do while studying abroad is volunteering. So if you've done volunteering, whether a couple hours a week, been part of the university or part of a club, you did some community service work, those kind of experiences, both when you're abroad and also back home, are really ways to advance your career. The other thing is to think about, and I talk about this in the first tip, is like, how do you sell this part of your study abroad as part of a larger career journey? So some people be like, oh, I studied abroad, it was interesting. But that's not the way to talk about your experience. Think about like, I chose to study abroad in this country because I'm really passionate about advancing change in the world. And the skills I gained in this experience relate to when I completed my studies and started my first job. So it's like thinking about how do you tell a compelling story that ties all your skills together. The ability to deal with challenges that was highlighted in the IAE list, but that really is important. That one of the things employers, regardless of the sector, they really want to see that people can deal with the unexpected difficulties that come up in any given workplace. And that one of the ways you can highlight that is, what you did in your study abroad experience. Sorry, I'm turning off my email again. And then international experience, increasingly it's a globalized world. So having experience overseas, and the more experience you have, the better. So let me go to the next point. So in terms of some concrete tips for making your application materials amazing, so the first thing is just some strategies, whether you're applying for an undergraduate program, a graduate program, jobs, internships. One of the things I highly recommend is to develop a tracking system. As it says in point number 1 here, we call it get your ducks in a row. So particularly if you're doing a job search, often a job search can involve applying to 50 to 100 to 200 jobs. And you want to just have a simple system saying, here's where I applied, here's the link to the job description, because sometimes they go offline. Here's the response I got, did I follow up, and some lessons you can learn if you got an interview or not. And I can tell you, once I applied for a job, and I think they contacted me like 6 or 9 months later, I don't even think the job description was online anymore. So also save the job descriptions. The second thing is, as you're starting to think about university, higher, post-grad or jobs, is like this number 2 should always be reading about kind of what are the trends in the field you want to. Are jobs growing? Are they disappearing? What about back in your home country? In terms of resume, I'm going to focus particularly on 4 key points. And again, you can find lots of tips on PCN on this. One is the structure. So overall, is your resume structured in a way that's easily readable? So it doesn't make sense where you have education, how your name shows up, your volunteer experience, your job, or that type of stuff. So one is the overall, some is the components of the resume. The second part is aesthetics. And basically what that means is, does your resume invite the reader in to be curious? Or often nowadays it's a computer that's just, in the first review that's just skimming for keywords. But please don't use small 10-point font to try to cheat the system. It's got to be something it's got to be pleasurable for the person reading it. And one of the ways to look at aesthetics is share your resume with your professors, a few peers, and just get a sense. Don't even ask about the content. Say, is this visually appealing to you? The third part is the content, so what is actually in there, and I'll talk more about one very key point there. And the fourth part is the context, just overall, is your resume tailored for the type of position or graduate program or university you're applying for? And then cover letters, this is a much longer discussion, but one of the key points in the cover letter is, if they ask for one, which most jobs do, is you really want to show how your entire life has destined you for this experience. Highlight a few key skills and experience and accomplishments without being egotistical. So one of the most important things on resumes, what we call is quantification. So basically, and I've seen thousands of resumes. I coach a lot of people. I've done my own resume always needs work. So a resume is never perfect. It's always a work in progress. But one of the things you really want to do is, when you have in your resume, let's say you volunteered in the US, in an environmental group. So what a lot of people do say, like, I volunteered, let's say for Greenpeace or whatever environmental group, and they're like, I volunteered and I did social media. Quantification means that you try to show, like, you volunteered and you managed an email list. And you might say the email list had 100,000 people, or you helped grow the email list, or you helped organize an event with 100 people. So where the numbers and the quantification works to your advantage, you want to list that. So that's one of the biggest mistakes I see on resumes, is that people just list the verb saying I volunteered or I managed a budget. But wherever possible, try to show the numbers and the results of what type of work you did. And if you're a part of a team, which most of us are, you can't claim credit for everything, but you can say, like, I was part of a team that organized a series of events for 500 people. I've got about 2 minutes left. So part of the way of advancing your career is thinking about, what is your digital profile? And you might not be a full expert yet, but one of the things you might consider doing, and I put over here, is like sharing your story. So if you like to blog or do videos, you might think about, if you do it once, no one's going to pay attention. You might say, what am I really passionate about? So you might say, I'm going to do a monthly YouTube video for 2 minutes just talking about study abroad or your sector. Or a great way to do this, you might do a little 1 or 2 videos with yourself, and then you might interview your peers, friends who are students or alum. So start profiling them and kind of decide, like, what's the story you want to work on. The second thing here is LinkedIn is incredibly important. I can't tell you how important it is, not in all regions of the world, but really thinking about using LinkedIn. And it's a much longer discussion, but we've got some tips on PCN and elsewhere. But making sure your profile is up to date, and all these things I'm talking about with your resume, is try to make sure your LinkedIn has some key accomplishments and it tells a story. And then again, Twitter is a great resource. I can talk more about that in questions. I'm just turning off my phone because I set a timer. These are some key resources to think about as you advance your career. So first thing, PCDN, we have newsletters with jobs, all sorts of places. You can talk about that. ProFellow, a friend of mine runs. It's a great database of fellowships, more at the grad and post-grad level. But again, you've already got 1 fellowship under your belt. Maybe some of you have 2. And often once someone becomes a single fellowship holder, it's easy to become a serial fellowshipper. IIE is a great resource, and the study here that I mentioned is really good. Net Impact is a great global resource for careers of impact. Rotary, I've been involved with, is a great place to look for fellowships, or they also have a youth club called Rotaract. Idealist is good, and these are just a couple other, and then professional networks. This is my email, and some links to PCM. I'm happy to be in touch if anybody has questions. So what I'm going to do now is close the PowerPoint. I'm going to stop the screen share because I went about 14 minutes, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments.
Excellent. Yeah, so people, please feel free to write any questions you have in the comment box on Facebook. I'm going to start off with a question. So as you know, the YES program has over 15 years of alumni. How relevant is it for alumni who maybe did the program in 2006 to 2007 to talk about their study abroad experience on their resume or in a cover letter? Is that something that at some point you should no longer refer to, or is it always valuable?
I mean, so I would say if you're let's say between 2 to 5 years out of your experience, then I think it's 100% relevant to talk about, include in a cover letter. If you're beyond 5 years to 10 years, then I would say it's definitely probably worth listing on your resume, but then I wouldn't really bring it up because it's so much in the past, unless it's a job where you, like if you studied abroad in China or the US and the job you're applying for relates directly to that geographic area, particular skill sector, then I think it's relevant. But in general, I'd say if it's more than 5 years, unless it's 100% relevant to the job where the employer brings it up, I wouldn't go into too much detail. But 1 to 5 years, I think it's very relevant to mention and get into how the skills you developed are relevant to where you want to advance your career.
Okay, great, thank you. When is it appropriate to use an example from study abroad experience while writing a cover letter or a resume if you can't find a direct correlation in the job posting?
So, I mean, the question is, you always want to really carefully look at the job postings to like, what are the core skills and abilities they're looking for? And so most job applications or job postings will never mention study abroad. Some of them might mention international experience. Some might mention language experience. So for example, if a job says we want experienced event organizing, like demonstrated events, demonstrated ability to organize events for groups of people. If in your study abroad experience you had that type of, let's say you helped organize a volunteer event at your university or in your community. So I wouldn't just mention, like, you can't just stick in there like study abroad if it's not integrated into your story. But if there's something you did on your study abroad experience that is relevant to a skill that the job requires or emphasizes international experience or cross-cultural or languages, then I think it's appropriate. But you can't just throw it in there. I see a lot of cover letters where people just do, it's almost like they do it by form, and there's no story. A cover letter has to tell a compelling story that ties together your professional, academic, and personal experience. And the most important thing that most people don't do is they don't actually talk about the particular employer. So I've seen hundreds of cover letters where people say, like, I want to work in international relations, and I'm passionate about human rights, or whatever sector of international relations. And then they say, and I've got all these skills and I wanted to have this job, but they say nothing about why that particular employer or why that particular job they're applying for. So you have to tie the things together.
You mentioned using Twitter as a tool to strengthen our resumes. How can we do that?
Okay, so Twitter, there's 3 ways. So one is Twitter, if you use it wisely, you can actually find a lot of professional opportunities on Twitter. And it's a longer discussion, but like follow organizations like IRN, IIE, the State Department, ministries of education in different countries, Fulbright. So just follow the organization, Rotary, the ones that offer fellowships. So it's almost like it just shows up in your Twitter feed. Follow PCDN, follow ProFellow. The second thing is social media, a lot of jobs now require you to have expertise or at least familiarity with social media. And it might be part of you can have a full-time job as a social media specialist, which often falls within communications or community management. So the second is actually knowing how to use the tools beyond just your personal ability. So one is experimenting with Twitter and understanding, how do you measure analytics? What makes for a compelling tweet? And then you start following influencers in your field. And influencers doesn't have to be someone who's 60 years old. It can just be someone you admire, a professor, a star. And then you get so much information from them. And then the third thing is, this is one way I've used Twitter quite interestingly. When you go to events, and it could also be an online event, IRN might think about doing this, is like a lot of events have a hashtag, so they have the @ with a keyword. So when you're at an event, if you're tweeting or following a Twitter feed, you can actually find people in real time. And this has happened to me a lot. Like, I see someone at an event, we don't know each other personally, but we're tweeting, and what they tweet is interesting, what I tweet is interesting, and we wind up chatting and having interesting conversations. So Twitter used the right way can actually lead to a lot of real world collaboration. And I think this has only happened once. I've been hired off of LinkedIn. So people have actually approached me on LinkedIn and hired me. I've actually hired someone mostly because of they had a good social media profile across channels, but they were very active on Twitter. And I was like, let's have coffee. And I hired them just as an adjunct professor, but it's because I saw their presence on Twitter, and it made me so curious about what they were doing. So it's that kind of thinking about Twitter, not just as passive engagement, but professional development. And then the last thing I'll say, like, if you're tweeting about, let's say, things only personal to you, then it doesn't really, let's say you're tweeting about the issues you're passionate about. you could even list your Twitter feed on your resume, but you got to Twitter handle, but you have to make sure you're comfortable. Like if you're posting about parties or things that are not professional, then don't list it. But if you're tweeting about things that you think an employer would be interested in learning about, like having that on your profile makes a difference.
Like in a way, it's advancing your resume or your cover letter in a
Yes.
permanent form.
And then even in your email signature, like one of the recommendations I have is as you start, if particularly if you're in the job search, is get a professional email signature. So there's sometimes you can do it for free, but like, have a photo if you're okay with that. You don't have to have a link to your LinkedIn, have a Twitter, make it professional. There's services you can pay some money, like $20 a year, or you can find probably some free ones, but like embed your social media channels that you're proud of that are professionally related. And my email signature, I don't list my Facebook because that's really only for personal, but I list Twitter, LinkedIn, and a couple of others.
From a YES alumni, they asked if I'm applying to a college abroad, how do I emphasize my exchange experiences to help me get into that particular college?
So I guess the first question would be like, what is the college in the same place you studied abroad would be one question. I'll give you my own personal thing. So I did junior abroad in Hungary in 1990, and I spent a year. I went back to the US, I graduated, and I had a great mentors that applied for Fulbright. So I applied for Fulbright to go back to Hungary. And I went back to university that I was based at as an exchange student. So basically I had a very compelling narrative that I chose to study abroad in this country. I learned the language pretty well. And here's the research and the work I want to do. So it's not about that college, it's about telling the compelling story of like why you studied abroad in the first place, what skills you developed, and how studying at this university in this country and the particular discipline all connects together. So it's not, don't get too stressed in the individual institution. Like you've got to make the case. And again, going back to what I said about jobs, you also have to make the case. You can't just say like, I want to study abroad, let's say at Humboldt University, in Berlin. I want to do my undergraduate degree or graduate degree at Humboldt. You got to be like, Humboldt is the university I'm choosing for these reasons. Like you've got to say why they should choose you, but you also make the case why you want to choose them, both as the institution, but also as the discipline. Like, at Georgetown, I was involved in admissions for 10 years. And I can tell you lots of people are like, I want to study at this is a graduate level. Like, I want to study at Georgetown. That's not a compelling reason. I'd be like, I want to study, maybe say I want to study at Georgetown because it's a great university, not compelling, but I want to study at Georgetown because it's doing innovative work in these areas. And that fits with my career path. And I want to work with these professors. That, you don't want to get so specific, but you have to tell a story that makes the person or the computer reviewing your application understand the case.
Yeah, and that goes back to your previous point about doing your research and knowing what you're applying to, keeping a copy of that so you can continue to go back and reference it.
And then the last thing I'll say is like, also ask your peers, so if you're in high school or finishing high school, ask, a professor you really like, friends, family, ask a few people to read your applications and critique them. And I'll tell you, because I was a fellowship advisor just on the side for 10 years, I made people cry, not because I was mean, because but like people would give me fellowship applications to review, and I'd be like, this is bad. And we go sometimes through 5 or 6 rounds. And so it doesn't mean that, and if you go through the rounds of review with experts, doesn't mean you'll get it, but it means it radically increases your chances. So like be open to the critiques.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, no one likes to be critiqued, but if that's what it's going to take for you to sharpen your resume or your cover letter or prepare for a job interview, then you have to be open to it. What are some of the most common mistakes you see in resumes? I know you mentioned people not using quantitative data, but other common mistakes you've seen.
So I'd say 4 things. So again, the quantification is the biggest one that people don't, they just list a bunch of things, they don't say anything. And again, if the resume is not telling a story, second thing is they try to squeeze in too much. For most people who are junior, I don't think that's a danger, but some people, they just try to put in everything. They try to cheat the system by making 10 9-point font because they want to put it all in. And then I would just say sometimes spelling mistakes, grammar, it's just not professionally done. So it's quantification, kind of aesthetics, and trying to stuff too much in. I mean, the number one thing I'd say, again, at the junior level, it's not that important because junior people, if you're just out of high school or college, tend not to have that much experience. So the junior level, it's more about trying to find things to put in. For, let's say, the first 1 to 3 years of career is often like, oh, I got to fill this up and make myself look like a professional. And then once you're at 3 to 5 years, it's more about taking stuff out.
Are you a big believer in a one-page resume, or do you think it can expand past the one page?
So I think all these things also vary by culture and geographic region and employer. So in general, if you're junior, I'd say under 3 years experience, one page tends to be the dominant norm. If you have over 5 years experience, let's say people who are early yesers, and you are applying in certain sectors like nonprofit sector, education, then 2 pages seems much more appropriate. And then sometimes less for CV, which is your whole employment history, but that's much more just in academia. But in general, if you're recent grad, 1 page is the right thing, unless you've done so much, like you're a Yes Fellow, you've started a nonprofit. Like if you've done a lot of things, 2 pages could be appropriate, but it depends on the sector.
Just to note, the alumnus who had his question answered about applying to colleges abroad says, "Thank you, Dr. Craig. Really appreciate all the knowledge you shared." I think we have time for one more question. So I was wondering if you had any experience on common questions in job interviews where it's appropriate to answer using a study abroad experience.
That's a great one. So I think it's a little similar to the first question. So one, I think probably the 3 most relevant questions. So often employers want to ask you about, tell me a challenge you faced. And so I think often all of us know in our study abroad experiences that there's lots of challenges. So I think if it was a recent challenge, 1 to 2 years, so you might, like, for example, I could say when I got to Hungary, even though my classes were in English, like I was so overwhelmed just by this bizarre language and cross-cultural shock and living in a dorm room with 4 people, but I can say like I wound up, and I was convinced I couldn't learn a language, but I used that experience. I learned the language. I actually changed from a semester to a year. I did volunteer work. So it's like, talk about the frustration, but never leave it at the frustration. Talk about how that changed you and the skills you developed. So that's the second thing. The first thing. The second thing I think is just talking about your curiosity for the world. And so particularly if you're applying for a job focused on international affairs, you can say like, I spent a year in China or Thailand, wherever, and I learned so much about how that country is increasing their public health or market access. So talk about your sectoral expertise, not your personal challenges. And then the third thing is you can talk about, since increasingly globalized world, you can just talk about in general how your dedication to advancing your skills as a global citizen.
Great. We actually just had 2 more questions come through.
I'm fine.
Okay, great. Is adding links onto your resume okay?
That's a good one. So I would say, I mean, a lot of times now things are reviewed by, it's called applicant tracking systems. And a lot of times, particularly in, let's say, the global north, but even in global south, resumes tend to be reviewed by computer at the first screening. So I think it's okay. I'm not for or against it, but I wouldn't do too many links because personally, I find it annoying sometimes. And I think if it's like if you did a master's, if you did a thesis, if you did something that you're really proud of, then you might actually include it in a cover letter if it's relevant, but don't go overboard on links. That's my personal opinion. Like, you have to decide for yourself.
I think this question came in after you said you had reviewed some applications at Georgetown. So what kind of soft skills or stories really stood out to you in college applications?
So I would say, like, I review a lot of fellowship applications. I still review for different places, and I review a lot of, I was involved with admissions as part of my job for 10 years, but always at the grad level. So I don't want to, undergrad, I've done some fellowship reviews. I mean, again, it all comes back to your story and, telling a compelling story about, I'll give you a perfect example. So my niece is wonderful. She was on an exchange program in Germany for a year, her last year of high school. And she applied for a bunch of fellowships prior to that, didn't get them, got this one, and then took that experience and applied to go to lots of universities. And she just had such a compelling story. Like I did the study abroad experience. I've done all this other volunteer work. She actually got paid work in the US. And then she got a full fellowship to a university in the US because she figured out how to leverage her pre-study abroad experience or study abroad to tell a compelling story. And she wants to do similar work to kind of what I've been doing. We'll see where she winds up, but work in international affairs and social change. So it's like, again, it's not about one thing. It's got to be coherent and integrated. And then, some people, another person I know, like some people tell stories of hardship, and that can work very well. But you have to be careful about how, you don't want to just say like, I had the fascinating question recently. Someone said like, what do people do in their resumes if they've been victims of torture and they haven't been displaced, or like really bad things have happened to them? Like, what do you do with that in a resume? Because there's huge gaps. So like, you shouldn't put on your resume that you've suffered politically, but it could be appropriate some cases to mention in an application or cover letter. But you have to be very careful like how you integrate that, and like also decide what do you feel comfortable sharing. So sometimes those stories of personal difficulties that you've overcome can radically strengthen your application, but it has to be careful what you put in there. And it doesn't have to be a difficulty. It can be a personal challenge, a success. But again, it all has to fit together in a coherent narrative, and then tie to, just same with employers, so tied to the institution, to the employer, and the sector. So again, going back to Georgetown, I mean, I helped run the conflict resolution masters. So for someone to say, I want to study conflict resolution doesn't mean anything, but if they said like, in my community, we've been working on conflict issues for the past 5 years, and I've seen the challenges, and I've done these 3 things to date, and really I've learned a lot, but I need more skills development, and developing these skills at your institution will help me work on these issues I'm most passionate about. That's the way of like getting into specifics.
That's a great answer. We had a latecomer, I think, who said, is LinkedIn really effective?
Yeah.
So I know you've already said you find it to be a fascinating tool.
Yeah, so what I'll say is, originally most people thought LinkedIn is only a place to find jobs. So if that's how you go on LinkedIn, like LinkedIn is not a place to find jobs. I'll say that like 3 times. I mean, you can find a job on LinkedIn, but it's not a place to find jobs. It's a place to build purpose-aligned networks with people who are doing interesting things all over the world, and to learn and to share. And if you come to LinkedIn as transactional, like, oh, I've got to get a job and LinkedIn's going to get me a job, possible. But if you come to LinkedIn saying like, I'm curious about the world and I want to interact with interesting people and learn and share, and that may help me, that'll help you expand your networks. And if you expand your networks, it can help you land a job. But it's got to be like the secondary approach. And so, and I can tell you like LinkedIn and LinkedIn more and more, again, it varies by geographic region. So I don't want to I think there's about 600 million users on LinkedIn. So Facebook has 2 billion, Twitter has about 300 million. So I don't want to say the whole world's on LinkedIn, but increasingly employers are going there. And particularly I'd say in the global north, but even some places in the global south, like employers will go and look at your LinkedIn profile. And and in particular, as you get to mid-career or senior, it's much more important. But even junior, it makes, and I'll give one example. So, and this was at a conference, I wasn't on this panel, but I heard a colleague I know who's a world-class expert at recruiting. She said, if you apply for a job, I'm going to look at your LinkedIn profile, like if you make the top 10% of candidates. And if I looked on your LinkedIn profile and I see we know someone in common, and you haven't referenced them as a way like to say like, I'm applying for if you haven't asked them to put in a word for you, or somehow reference that person within the application process, that's going to look like a negative, because networks are so important these days. And some people would call it, corruption or like, influence, but basically a lot of jobs are filled through connections, even if you apply directly. So LinkedIn is one of the ways to think about it, is like you've got your network in your town or country or university, but LinkedIn is a way to expand your network to the world. So let's say you apply for a job at, it doesn't work in our organization. Let's say you try for a job in Amnesty International in London or anywhere, Germany. And you would go through your LinkedIn network and say, who do I know who works at Amnesty? And you can't say like, give me a job. But if you know them well enough, you might say, would you be willing to talk for 10 minutes about Amnesty? Would you be willing to put in a word to the hiring officer? So, I mean, you have to be careful not to go overboard with that. And it won't, but those kind of things can make a difference.
That's really
to say one more thing, and also LinkedIn has a lot of groups, so you can find a group for anything. So in LinkedIn groups, I don't like the functionality, but you can join like a group PCN has a group, IIE has a group, I don't know if IRON does, but you can find a group like environment or jobs or internships. Also, if you join a professional group on LinkedIn, and I think they're all free, maybe some people charge, but then you can like look through and I'd say the #1 way to use LinkedIn is younger professional. I wouldn't call it stalking. I would say like look at profiles of people you admire and look at their career path. And then sometimes, even if it's like the CEO of an organization, like you can connect with people. They might not choose to respond, but a great way to say like, oh, I want to work in environmental, solar energy, and finance. So do some searching and look at people's profiles and see what they did. And again, like, and then start friending some of them, and then, again, don't go overboard with this, but you could ask not the CEOs, but you could ask junior level people, would you be open to a 20-minute conversation? Or if you're going to move to a country, study abroad or work, you might say, I'm in this country. Do you have any suggestions for internships? So it's like, if you only use it today for results now, forget about it. But it's a long-term investment.
Great. And there's so many Yes alumni on LinkedIn as well. I just want to make sure everyone knows that. And you have that common network, and that's the way you can start to reach out to other people and build on people within your network.
I mean, one question for you, Emma, like if someone is a Yes alum, is there like a badge they can put on LinkedIn that then connects them? Because like a lot of organizations, you put the organization, then you can see everybody else who was that. So is there any kind of badge that helps them find other Yes alum?
I'm not sure if they have a badge, but I can look into it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and we have gone over our 30 minutes, but thank you so much for joining us. This was really interesting. You clearly have a wealth of information and knowledge, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it with some of our Yes and Yes Abroad alumni. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube page, and of course, since it was on Facebook Live, it will live there as well. And
Thank
for you that are joining, thank you, and I hope that this is going to be useful as you market your study abroad experience in a way that highlights specific skills that are relevant to all of your future opportunities and endeavors.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Bye, everyone.